I'm not proud of everything I've done. But I also can't lie and say I regret all of it. Some things just happen when you're looking the other way. Or when you haven't looked at yourself in a very long time. Before we start, this isn't an easy story to tell. It's personal, messy, and full of choices I never thought I'd make. If betrayal or broken trust hits too close to home, you might want to stop here. But if you've ever felt lost in a relationship, or questioned who you're becoming, maybe this will sound more familiar than you'd expect. Here goes. My name is Dallery Monroe. I've been married to my husband, Colby Odom, for 8 years. 8 stable, safe, structured years. Colby is a good man. No, he's a great man. He's loyal. He brings me coffee every morning without fail. Kisses me on the forehead before he leaves for work. He never forgets anniversaries or birthdays. He's dependable. And that's the word I always go back to, dependable. Not exciting. Not surprising. Not dangerous or passionate or unpredictable. Just dependable. And I know that should be enough. For a long time, it was enough. But lately, I've felt like I'm watching our life from the outside. Like we've turned into characters playing a married couple, instead of actually being one. We sleep in the same bed, but it feels like there's a canyon between us. We make small talk, share bills, share chores. We're partners. But we're not lovers anymore. There's no shouting, no cheating, no breaking of plates. Just silence. Just drifting. And maybe that's the part that hurts the most. The absence of anything to fight for. I wasn't always like this. I used to be someone who laughed until I cried. Who danced barefoot in the kitchen at midnight. Someone who could barely wait to get home to him. I remember our wedding day like it was yesterday. Colby stood at the altar, smiling like he'd won the lottery. I couldn't stop shaking. I was so in love, so certain we'd found what people spend their whole lives chasing. We had dreams. Big ones. We were going to travel. Build a business together. Start a family when the time felt right. We used to lie in bed and talk about the future like it was our playground. But life has this way of slowly shrinking those dreams until they fit neatly inside a routine. And now? Now I find myself staring at the ceiling at night, wondering what happened to that girl. Not Colby. Me. Where did she go? When did I stop feeling? When did I become someone who gets dressed in the dark, walks out the door, and just functions? I didn't plan for anything to change. I never sat down and thought, I need something more. It was more like an ache. A dull one. Low, constant. Until something, or someone, pressed right up against it. But that came later. This all really started on a Thursday. Just a regular, boring Thursday at the office. The kind where the coffee's cold and every meeting feels pointless. I was about to head straight home, maybe reheat leftovers and zone out in front of a show Colby and I weren't even pretending to watch together anymore. But right as I packed up my things, my phone buzzed. It was Ava Galindo, my closest friend at work. She's fun, single, and always trying to shake me out of my shell. Drinks after work. You in? I hesitated. I really did. I had laundry waiting, emails to catch up on, and a husband at home who, despite the distance, would notice if I stayed out late. But something in me whispered, go. Just go. And before I could second-guess myself, I typed back, sure. 1 drink. I remember putting on a little lipstick before heading out. Just a touch. Not for anyone else. Just to remind myself that I was still a woman. Not just someone's wife. Not just a coworker, or a bill payer, or a routine on legs. As I walked out the office doors, the evening air hit me, and I realized. I didn't even remember the last time I did something just for me. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me, there's so much more to uncover. I didn't expect much from that night. One drink. Maybe two if I got carried away. The plan was simple: show up, be social, smile when appropriate, and head home before the guilt crept in. Ava had picked a place just a few blocks from the office. It wasn't flashy or loud, just a cozy little bar tucked between a flower shop and an old record store. The kind of spot where people actually talked, not shouted over music. Warm amber lighting made everything feel softer, like it was trying to blur out the hard edges of the day. As soon as I stepped in, I heard the familiar sound of glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling like a tide, and the soft strumming of some acoustic cover playing through the speakers overhead. Nothing wild. Nothing dramatic. Just relaxed. The kind of relaxed I hadn't felt in months. Ava waved me over to a corner booth where a few coworkers had already gathered. Everyone looked lighter than they did during the day. Jackets off, ties loosened, makeup smudged from laughter or a long shift. The usual stress of work melted away when drinks appeared, and stories started flowing with the rhythm of casual chatter. I slipped into a seat next to Ava and ordered something I hadn't tasted in years, an old favorite that once made me feel adventurous and free. That first sip hit like a memory. A little bitter, a little sweet, with a hint of something forgotten. People laughed louder as the night wore on. Someone made a joke about the office printer being cursed, and the whole table erupted. I laughed too. Not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh. One of those that bubbles up without permission. It surprised me. I caught Ava watching me, her eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. "You needed this," she said, tapping her glass against mine. I nodded. I didn't even argue. She was right. One drink turned into two. Then three. Stories turned more personal, secrets spilled easier, and slowly, one by one, people began making their exits. They had trains to catch, babysitters waiting, early meetings the next day. Normal reasons. Grown-up responsibilities. Eventually, Ava stood up too, hugging me tight. "You good?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I replied, meaning it more than I expected. "I think I'll just finish this and head out." She nodded, threw on her coat, and disappeared into the night. And just like that, I was alone. I sat at the bar now, my fingers lazily circling the rim of my glass, the last of the drink catching the light. I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Something in me needed to stay a little longer, like maybe if I sat still enough, I could remember who I used to be. And then I felt it. That strange sense you get when someone is looking at you. I turned my head slightly, and there he was. Standing a few feet away, leaning casually against the bar like he belonged there. His presence was easy. Not forced. Not loud. He looked to be in his early 50s, well dressed in that effortless way older men sometimes pull off. Sharp eyes, a slight smirk, and this calm, confident energy that didn't try to impress, it just was. He caught my gaze and smiled, not the kind that feels predatory or rehearsed. Just warm. Curious. He stepped closer and said, "I was hoping you'd still be here. I've been trying to find the right moment to come say hello." I blinked, surprised. "Oh?" He extended a hand. "Leon." "Dallery," I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, but not overbearing. "Can I buy you a drink?" he asked. I paused for half a second, instinctively glancing at my nearly empty glass. Part of me wanted to decline. Say I was heading out. Keep this simple. But the truth was, I didn't want to leave yet. And not just because of the drink. "Sure," I said. "Why not?" He ordered for both of us, choosing something simple but classic. Then we settled into a pair of bar stools, and the conversation just happened. No awkward pauses. No weird small talk. Just an easy, fluid back and forth like we were catching up after years apart, even though we'd just met. He told me he was in town for work. Sales training or some conference. I can't remember the exact title, but it didn't matter. What caught my attention was how quickly we skipped the usual surface chatter and went deeper. He asked what I did, but not in a checklist way. He seemed genuinely interested in what made me tick. He listened. That part caught me off guard. I found myself telling him about little things, about my job, my quiet neighborhood, how my husband and I had started looking into new hobbies to shake things up. I didn't overshare. Just enough to show I wasn't out here pretending to be someone I wasn't. He nodded thoughtfully at some point and said, "You're married. You seem happy, but you don't sound fulfilled." I tilted my head. That's a bold thing to say to someone you just met. Maybe, he said. But I'm a pretty good judge of tone. And I've been around long enough to recognize that sound in someone's voice. What sound is that? The sound of someone who misses something they can't quite name. That made me quiet. He sipped his drink, then added, "My marriage has been on autopilot for years. We haven't touched each other in over 6 months. I think she stopped noticing me a long time ago. I'm not mad about it. We just became different people." I nodded slowly. That happens. Yeah, he said. But I still crave connection. Real connection. Not something that lives in a shared calendar. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw that same ache I'd been carrying. Not lust. Not a come on. Just a man who wanted to be seen. And maybe that's why I told him what I did next. "I'm not unhappy," I said carefully. "Colby is a good man. He's kind. Loyal. Steady. But we've been talking. Quietly. About maybe opening things up." His eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Really? We're not there yet. There are rules. Boundaries. It's still new. Still fragile." He smiled again, small, almost wistful. "That's rare. Most people just leap off the cliff and hope it all works out." "I'm not much of a leaper," I replied. "Maybe you just haven't had the right reason," he said. There was a long pause then. Neither of us rushed to fill it. We just sat in that moment, that strange, charged quiet where everything feels both completely normal and impossibly important. Then Leon leaned in, just enough to close the space between us slightly. His voice was low. Gentle. And he asked, "So what would your husband say if I kissed you right now?" Time slowed down after he asked me that question. What would your husband say if I kissed you right now? He hadn't touched me. He hadn't leaned in any closer than he already was. But suddenly, the air between us felt warmer, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest, waiting for an answer I wasn't ready to give. I didn't speak right away. I stared into my drink, my fingers tightening around the glass, like maybe if I gripped it hard enough, I could ground myself, or buy a few more seconds before the weight of the moment crashed down. My heart was beating faster now, not in fear, but in something much harder to name. It wasn't just about Leon. It was about me. About the quiet pull I'd been ignoring for far too long. The one that whispered things I didn't want to admit aloud. I looked at him. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't trying to convince me of anything. He just looked patient. Present. As if he'd accept whatever answer I gave him, no judgment, no pressure. And maybe that's what made it harder. I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen, debating whether or not to do something I hadn't done all night, text Colby. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't planning to confess. I didn't even know what I was confessing to yet. Eventually, I typed, "You awake?" I watched the little dots. Nothing. No reply. I waited another moment, hoping maybe he'd respond. Hoping he'd give me something. A reason. A tether. Anything to remind me that I belonged somewhere else. Still nothing. And just like that, I felt the answer form inside me. Not a scream. Not even a voice. Just a quiet, settled knowing. That this choice, whatever it turned into, was mine alone. I slipped my phone back into my bag, stood slowly, and looked at Leon. "I should probably go," I said softly. He nodded. Not disappointed. Not smug. Just still. "But I don't want to," I added, and I felt my throat tighten as the words left my mouth. He reached out, gently placed a hand at the small of my back, and said, "Then don't." The walk to his hotel wasn't long, but it felt endless. The streets were calm, the kind of quiet that only shows up late at night when the world feels far away and anything is possible, or forgivable. We didn't talk much on the way. Just soft glances. Shared silence. I wasn't thinking about consequences. I wasn't thinking about lines or boundaries or vows. I was thinking about how alive I felt. How long it had been since someone looked at me like I was seen, not just familiar. How long it had been since I looked in the mirror and felt like a woman, not a task manager, not a wife with a grocery list, but a woman. When we got to the hotel lobby, I almost said goodbye. Almost turned away. But I didn't. I followed him to the elevator. Watched the numbers rise. Heard the ding as the doors opened. My feet moved on their own. No rush. No panic. Just quiet surrender. The room was simple, but warm. One light on near the bed. A suitcase by the desk. A faint hum of the city outside the window. It smelled like linen and hotel soap. He offered me water, and I shook my head. We stood there for a beat, just looking at each other. No games. No pretense. When he stepped forward and cupped my face, his hands were warm. Gentle. The kind of touch that asked before it took. And then he kissed me. It wasn't fire or frenzy or desperation. It was stillness. It was the kind of kiss that made everything else disappear, not in a dramatic, sweeping way, but in a way that felt like I'd finally stopped holding my breath after years of shallow inhales. I melted into it, not because I wanted to betray Colby, but because I wanted to remember how it felt to be wanted. To be cherished. To be alive in my own skin. There are parts of that night I'll keep only for myself. Not out of shame, but out of something quieter, something sacred. What mattered most wasn't what we did, but how I felt. I laughed that night. I really laughed. The kind that takes you off guard. Leon had this way of telling stories that made me forget time. We talked for hours, even in the quiet spaces between everything else. He didn't make me feel like someone's wife. Or someone's regret. He made me feel like someone who mattered again. Later, when the silence returned and the lights dimmed, I lay beside him, wrapped in a stillness I hadn't known in years. Not the cold kind of stillness that follows routine or disinterest, but the soft kind. The one that comes after a storm has passed and the air is clear. I stared at the ceiling, my heart beating in slow, heavy thumps. I wasn't crying. I wasn't smiling. I was just awake. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt wide awake. But that calm only lasted for so long. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting me slightly. I reached for it, heart skipping. It was a message from Colby. "Hey babe, are you almost home?" And just like that, reality crept back in, quiet and undeniable. The vibration of my phone pulled me back to earth faster than I was ready for. Colby's message was simple. No punctuation. No suspicion. "Hey babe, are you almost home?" For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My heart had already started racing before I'd even read the words, but now it pounded harder. Not from fear of being caught, but from the reality that I had to go back. That all of this, the quiet, the warmth, the feeling of being seen, was temporary. I swung my legs off the side of the bed and slowly stood. My clothes were scattered in a way that suddenly made everything feel louder. My blouse, half folded on the chair. My necklace draped over the lamp. My phone charger still plugged in. I didn't say much as I got dressed. Just moved slowly, quietly, like I didn't want to break the fragile calm that had settled between us. Leon watched me from the bed. He didn't say anything at first either. He didn't try to stop me or ask when we'd talk again. He just sat there, shirtless and still, his hands folded in his lap like he understood that silence was the only language that made sense right now. When I slipped my shoes on and grabbed my bag, I finally looked at him. "Thank you," I said, my voice soft. And I meant it, not for the night, or the escape, but for reminding me that I still existed beyond the labels I carried. He gave me a gentle nod. No guilt. No expectations. Just acceptance. I walked out without looking back. Outside, the air had cooled. The kind of cool that settles deep in your bones, even if you're fully dressed. I pulled my jacket tight and ordered an Uber with trembling fingers. The wait time said 3 minutes, but it felt longer. Every second dragged with questions I wasn't ready to answer. The car pulled up, headlights cutting through the quiet street. I slid into the back seat and gave the driver my address. The hum of the engine filled the space between us. I leaned my head against the window, watching the city slip by in pieces, flashes of streetlights, dark storefronts, blurry shapes of people moving through a world I suddenly felt disconnected from. In the silence of the ride, my mind filled with noise. I replayed everything. Every word, every glance, every laugh I'd shared with Leon. The things he made me remember about myself. The way his presence had peeled back a layer I didn't realize I'd covered with routine and responsibility. I wasn't thinking about the physical. I was thinking about the feeling. The freedom of being outside the lines. The release of being touched not just with hands, but with interest. With intention. But then, as the car pulled into my neighborhood, something shifted. A heaviness settled in my chest. My street looked exactly as I'd left it, quiet, dim, familiar. But now it felt different. Like returning to a version of myself I didn't fully fit into anymore. The house looked peaceful. Lights off in the front. Curtains drawn. Nothing unusual. I stepped inside and was met with the faint smell of lavender. The kind of subtle comfort that only comes from home. Shoes by the door. Keys in the tray. My life, untouched. I found Colby half asleep on the couch, the television playing some old movie he'd probably put on just to keep the silence away. He opened his eyes slowly when he heard the door click shut. "Hey," he said, voice low and groggy. "You have fun?" I forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah. It was nice." He stretched a little and shifted upright. "Glad you went. You looked like you needed it." And just like that, the weight in my chest tripled. He wasn't suspicious. He wasn't cold. He was kind. Familiar. The man I married. The man I'd been slowly growing away from, even while he stayed exactly the same. I kissed his forehead gently, then whispered, "I'm gonna shower." He nodded, already drifting back into sleep. I walked into the bathroom and turned the water on. Hot. Too hot. But I didn't turn it down. Steam filled the air as I stepped under the spray. I stood there longer than I needed to. Not to scrub anything away, but to soften the noise in my head. I wasn't trying to erase what happened, I knew I never could. I just needed quiet. I needed time to hear myself think. The water hit my shoulders in steady rhythm, and I closed my eyes, letting it drown out the voices, my own guilt, my confusion, the fear of what it all meant. Was it worth it? What did it say about me that I hadn't stopped it? Why did it feel right and wrong at the same time? I didn't have answers. Just 100 questions that circled without resting. When I finally crawled into bed beside Colby, he instinctively shifted closer in his sleep, his hand brushing against mine. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, the sound of his breathing steady and safe. He didn't know. He may never know. But I knew. And that was enough to keep me awake for hours. The next morning came without warning. I woke to the smell of coffee brewing, his usual habit, reliable as always. I slipped into the kitchen and found him in his usual spot, scrolling through his phone with that casual ease I'd always admired. He looked up and smiled. "Morning." "Morning," I replied, trying to steady my voice. He handed me a mug without a word, then glanced at me over the rim of his cup. "So, anything interesting happened last night?" The question hung in the air. Light, curious, innocent. And I lied. I smiled and said, "Nothing much. Just talked and laughed." It was good to see everyone outside the office. He nodded, accepting it without hesitation. And in that moment, I felt both relieved and sick. Like I'd passed a test I didn't want to be taking. The day moved on. I answered emails. Folded laundry. Went through the motions. But that night, as I sat alone on the edge of our bed, my phone buzzed again. A message. From Leon. "Hope I didn't ruin anything. You deserve to feel alive again." I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen, unsure whether to delete it or respond. But I didn't do either. I just let it sit there, glowing quietly in the dark. The days after were quieter than I expected. Not because anything had changed on the outside, but because everything had shifted inside of me. I went back to work. Answered emails. Sat through meetings. I smiled when someone cracked a joke and nodded along in conversation, but it was like watching my life through a sheet of glass. Close enough to reach, too distant to feel. Food tasted like nothing. Music felt flat. Even the warmth of the sun on my face during my lunch breaks didn't stir me like it used to. Everything just dulled. And Colby, he was still Colby. He still brought me my favorite coffee in the morning. Still kissed me on the forehead before leaving the house. Still asked if I needed anything when he stopped at the store. Kind. Thoughtful. Familiar. But every time I looked at him, I saw a stranger. Not because he had changed. But because I had. I tried. I really did. One evening, I made his favorite meal from scratch, roasted garlic chicken, the exact way he liked it. I lit a few candles, put on music from our early dating days, even wore the soft sweater he once said made my eyes stand out. He smiled, genuinely touched by the effort. We sat. We ate. We talked. And still, there was a distance. An invisible wall between us that neither of us could name, let alone tear down. The laughter felt thin. The silence afterward hung a little too long. When we went to bed that night, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. But I felt myself disappear into the mattress. The next day, I told Ava everything. We sat on a bench outside the office during lunch. I barely got through the first sentence before my voice cracked. "I did it," I whispered. "I crossed the line." She turned to me, stunned. "Wait, you?" I nodded, blinking fast. "I never thought you actually would," she said gently. "You're the most loyal person I know." "I didn't think I would either," I said, my voice breaking. And then I cried. Not just tears of guilt, but tears of exhaustion, of confusion, of finally releasing something I had kept buried for far too long. She didn't say much after that. She just sat beside me, her presence enough. No judgment. No advice. Just a space to fall apart. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about Leon. I never messaged him back. Never reached out again. I didn't block his number, but I didn't open that door either. Whatever we had, whatever that night was, felt like a snapshot I wasn't sure how to process, let alone repeat. It wasn't really about Leon. It never truly was. It was about how he looked at me. It was about how I felt when someone paid attention. When someone asked how I was, not out of habit, but with curiosity. It was about laughing again. Feeling electricity in my chest. Being reminded that I was still a woman, not just a role I'd been playing by default. It was about remembering that I still mattered, even outside the framework of being someone's wife. And now? Now I live in the in-between. I never told Colby. I wake up next to him each morning, carry out our routine, and keep this quiet place inside me where the truth lives. I don't know if that makes me a coward or just someone trying to protect something already cracked. Maybe I'm afraid of what the truth would break beyond repair. Maybe I'm afraid of admitting, out loud, that I let myself be selfish. Or maybe, deep down, I know I'll always carry this with me, whether he knows or not. What I know for sure is this: I'm not proud. But I'm not entirely sorry either. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was a cry for help. What I know, in my bones, is that for one night, I felt like me again. Not a wife. Not a coworker. Not someone holding a marriage together with politeness and routine. Just a woman, wanted, seen, and alive. And now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever done something you couldn't explain, even to yourself? Something that didn't make sense on paper, but felt painfully real in the moment? Do you think I should tell Colby? Would you? Would you carry a truth like this quietly, or let it burn everything down? Let me know what you would do. Drop your thoughts in the comments. No judgment. Just honesty. And if this story resonated with you, even a little, please, don't forget to like, share and subscribe.